What is the most popular episode of Joe Rogan ever?
I suspect it has something to do with UFOs.
It does. It is the supposed guy named Bob Lazar who's supposed to be a UFO whistleblower.
We view ourselves at the top of the food chain. What if we're not anywhere near there?
I don't think we are.
What if we're just consumables?
66 million views on YouTube alone. People want to know about this topic. If people have been following the news lately, they're aware that this is actually quite extraordinary, that the US government is actually releasing documents on UFOs and UAPs.
Of course, we have the movie that is now all sorts of conversation by Steven Spielberg on Disclosure Day.
He says that the movie is, quote, more truth than fiction. When Disclosure Day happens, we have to accept that we haven't been alone since the beginning of time. What I take from Spielberg is he's saying, look, this has implications for people's personal worldviews. He's calling this disclosure the most extraordinary event in human history. So bigger than, Christ walking on earth.
I have two people in my life who will remain completely unnamed, who will look me in the eyes and just say, I saw something that I cannot explain. The kind of light saucer boom, boom, left, they swear by it and they don't know how to make sense of it. There's enough of that to at least make all of us kind of have pause and go, wait a minute, could there be something to this? If aliens were discovered or disclosed, would that disprove God? Would it imply that aliens might be our creators and that humans are not unique? Our guest today, Dr. Casey Luskin, has some thoughts that might surprise you. And frankly, Casey, when you sent me a note, they also surprised me. So I'm eager to get into this. First time I've talked about UFOs on my channel. So you ready to rock and roll?
This is also, well, actually, it's my second interview on UFOs. We did one for ID the Future recently, but I haven't done a lot of media on this topic, so I'm still also kind of fresh.
Good. All right, so let's jump in. Why do you think that there's been so much recent interest in UFOs? Like, what's a little recent history of how we got to where we are today?
Sure. So I'm sure if folks have been reading the news lately, at the beginning of May of 2026, the US government started to release, or as they call it, disclose, various files they have supposedly showing UFOs. Also, now they call them UAPs, which stands for Unidentified Anomalous Phenomena. It's not unidentified aerial phenomena because some of them go underwater, apparently. At least this is what they're saying.
All right.
I didn't know this. I was actually getting it wrong.
It's news to me.
Yeah, I didn't know this. So I'm not a ufologist, okay? This is not an area where I'm like, going to UFO conventions. We can talk more about that. But I think if people have been following the news lately, they're aware that this is actually quite extraordinary, that the US government is actually releasing documents under the order of President Trump. He issued an order back in February for the federal government to release its files, its documents on UFOs and UAPs. So this is something that has never happened before, as far as the government sort of starting to go public and come clean with what it has. And this disclosure, so to speak, as it's called, it didn't come out of nowhere, Sean. This actually, if you trace back, and I remember following this going back to like the late 2010s, around 2017, there was a flurry of news articles that came out. I think it was like the New York Times, Washington Post, CNN. So very, very major mainstream news media put out these stories about some military pilots who back in the mid-2000s had these encounters with these strange craft, whatever they might be, right? And so this caused a lot of stir. But even that was a big step because we'd never seen mainstream media, treating this issue as anything other than kind of like a punchline, right? They were actually saying, look, there have been these encounters by military personnel. They don't know what this is. And they were talking about this in the context of not, are there little meat green men, but what's going on? Could this pose a national security threat? Is this showing that maybe other countries like China or whatever have technology that are far more advanced than our own? Or is this something else? Whatever it is, they're saying we need to start taking this seriously, not just kind of, use it as a jokey kind of thing. And I think that's been kind of the angle people have been approaching this from. So then fast forward a few more years, 2022, 2023, 2024, U.S. Congress actually holds hearings on UFOs and UAPs, okay?
Amazing.
And, this is like, I never thought you'd see Congress. And these were not like the fringe crazy members of Congress. This was very bipartisan. People on both sides of the aisle, people who are very serious, taking this, people who were on like, national security committees, taking this issue very, very seriously. And they brought in a lot of these same military personnel who were talked about in those news stories that came out in 2017. And these were, again, very serious people, former military intelligence officers, military pilots, people who had pretty high credentials. They were not your stereotypical tinfoil hat, wearing, nutballs or whatever. No offense to the people who wear
Yeah.
tinfoil hats, but they were people who had very, very impressive credentials who we would be inclined to take their testimony seriously, not just throw it away and dismiss it, And so then fast forward a little bit more. There was actually a documentary that came out at the end of last year. I didn't even know about this till a friend of mine said, Casey, have you seen this new documentary called The Age of Disclosure? It was on Amazon. And so I watched this documentary, and it was like kind of a rehash of a lot of the stuff that came out in these congressional hearings of the last few years, which I did actually watch. But this documentary, you can get it on Amazon, and you can rent it for a few bucks or whatever. And it had, again, high-profile people with very impressive credentials saying that they have seen craft doing things that no human technology can do. They've got it on radar with a lot of our advanced radar systems and the latest fighter jets and so forth. We can track things better than we ever have. And, there's some really crazy stories people tell of seeing things. And, I'm not saying I believe it or I know what's going on. I'm actually very much an agnostic on the question of whether ET life exists. We can get into that some more, Sean.
Sure.
But, I just think people are talking about this. Then so that was at the end of last year, this documentary comes out. Now fast forward to February. It was kind of interesting. I'm not saying it was planned. I don't think it was. But former President Obama goes on this podcast and he gets asked, do you believe in aliens? Okay. And Obama says, aliens are real. It's like, what? Obama says this? And kind of like drop that bomb. He very quickly added, but I haven't seen any evidence of them. And then after the podcast, he clarified things a little bit more. We'll talk about the argument he made, from the size and the vastness of the universe. Aliens must exist. We've all heard that argument.
Okay.
5 days after that, President Trump says, well, look, Obama shouldn't have been saying this because it actually violates his national security clearance. And that was when Trump said, I am ordering the government to release its UFO files. Now, some people might get cynical and say, oh, this is President Trump trying to distract from this or that. Or other people will say, look, President Trump is a hero. Whatever the answer is, doesn't really matter to me. I'm not trying to get into that. It's just very interesting that now the government is releasing these files. So that brings us to where we are today. In my opinion, it shows a lot of little grainy black and white dots kind of, buzzing around. If you're hoping to see little green men or, UFOs and Area 51 hangars, you're going to be sorely disappointed. So it's definitely not enough to satisfy the skeptics, of which I would consider myself to be one. However, it's interesting, and we can talk more about that. Yeah.
We can. Of course, we have the movie that is now being all sorts of conversation by Steven Spielberg on Disclosure Day, which is just heightening and increasing the conversation. And in some ways, there's the evidence, did this happen? There's the scientific question, what would it take for this to happen? What would it mean? And there's all sorts of theological questions. Now, we'll hit on a couple of theological questions. You're a geologist, so I really want you to weigh in from your scientific expertise. But maybe tell us, what do you personally believe about ETs?
Sure. Well, and I'm so glad you mentioned Disclosure Day, because Steven Spielberg, either there's some grand vast conspiracy, or he just got really lucky that he timed his movie to come out right when the government is releasing these documents. Disclosure Day is a movie about disclosure, the government secrets being released. I think it's kind of like a whistleblower in the movie. But Steven Spielberg has been going around doing a lot of media for his movie. He says that the movie is, quote, more truth than fiction. And he says it will, quote, upend all established order, okay? And he says, when Disclosure Day happens, we have to accept that we haven't been alone since the beginning of time. So what I take from Spielberg is he's saying, look, this has implications for people's personal worldviews. It's going to really rattle, the established order and what people believe. And so, obviously that's his own personal view, but he's calling this disclosure the most extraordinary event in human history. So bigger than, Christ walking on earth, bigger than, anything, according to Steven Spielberg, is our supposedly becoming aware that there are extraterrestrial life elsewhere in the universe. And of course, Spielberg has kind of been our cultural bard. He's the guy that made E.T. He's the guy that made War of the Worlds, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, 1977. He's made all these famous alien movies over the years. So people are really paying attention to this right now. And I think that he really does speak for a lot of people when, this could actually impact people's worldviews. What is the most popular episode of Joe Rogan ever? Do you know what it is?
I don't know the answer to that, but I suspect it has something to do with UFOs.
It does. It is the supposed guy named Bob Lazar who's supposed to be a UFO whistleblower. 66 million views on YouTube alone, okay?
Has recently been talking about this, and that he can't talk about it because it's classified, but he said you'd be up at night with the things that I've seen. He said we just need you to disclose it all. I'm sick of it. This country would have become unglued, I think, if they would have heard all that I heard.
So whatever you think of Bob Lazar and that whole episode, you can go watch it if you want. This much we have to be clear on. People want to know about this topic. People are really interested in it, and it's only becoming more and more interesting. We have the mainstream media, we have the federal government taking this issue more and more seriously. I'm a Christian, you're a Christian, a lot of your listeners are Christians, but whether we're Christians or non-Christians, everybody wants to think about this topic. What are the implications for our own origins of humanity, the origins of life? Where do we come from? This is actually a much bigger topic than I think a lot of folks appreciate, and people want to hear about it. So I'm really grateful for you being open to it.
Everybody's interested in this. I think of the movie by Carl Sagan, Contact, years ago. Matthew McConaughey was in it, of course. And even that movie at the end, there were kind of aliens that appear as a father and communicate you're not alone. Like there's meaning in a vast universe that's there. Christians, I mean, everybody's fascinated by this question. Are we alone? Are we not alone? So I can see why the interest is back. I'm eager to see a disclosure day. Spielberg, in case you hear this, the invitation is open. You are welcome on my podcast anytime. We'll treat you here well at Biola. And I'd love to know his fascination with this. Does he really believe what he said? Is it a part of the advertisement? I have no idea. But let's jump into your take on this. So you sent me this provocative piece in the Epic Times, which is also at townhall.com, about how discovering aliens would not refute intelligent design or hurt the case for the existence of God, but actually strengthen the arguments for why God must exist. Now, that's going to strike most people as like, wait a minute, the opposite of what they expect. But tell us, before we get into details, what you are arguing for.
Yeah, and let me also, I don't think I actually answered your last question completely about my own personal beliefs, okay? So I would consider myself to be agnostic on the question of whether there is physical extraterrestrial life on other planets, okay? I just don't know. As a Christian, I believe that the Bible really doesn't speak to this issue. And I'm not here to tell God what he could or could not do. If God wanted to make life on other planets and create life elsewhere in the universe, he is certainly free to do that. So I try to keep an open mind on this. And so I've followed this issue kind of, I would say mostly loosely for a number of years. I don't have super strong views on it. I'm skeptical that a lot of what people claim to see as ETs really are, alien UFOs or whatever like that. I think that the vast majority of so-called UFO sightings can be easily explained by things like, human technology, drones, weather phenomena, or frankly, somebody being on drugs or drunk or just out of their mind, But there is a certain percentage that is harder to explain, and that's where it gets really interesting. So again, I'm not an expert on the UAP phenomena or UFOs, but I do like to think about these things from a scientific angle, and that's kind of where I'm coming from. If we can say, for the sake of argument, if UFOs actually did exist, what would the implications be? Not UFOs, but actual alien life, ETs. If they did exist, what would be the implications for origins, intelligent design, evolution, and our belief in God? Yeah, so that's kind of what I want to talk about.
Okay, I love that. By the way, I think I land probably where you do. I'm agnostic. I just haven't seen any evidence that's enough to convince me. But I have two people in my life who will remain completely unnamed, who will look me in the eyes and just say, I saw something that I cannot explain. The kind of light saucer, boom, boom, left. They were not on drugs. I know that for sure. It was long before drones, and they swear by it, and they don't know how to make sense of it. I don't know exactly what to do with that. And these are people I know directly and trust with my life. There's enough of that to at least make all of us kind of have pause and go, wait a minute, could there be something to this? That's really what's interesting. Now, before we get back to your article in the Epic Times, when we talk about extraterrestrial life, when I started to study intelligent design, there were some distinctions that were made that were helpful to me, because there seems to be a difference between like looking for life on Mars, which might be microbial life, animal type organisms, but then complex technological organisms, intelligent life like us that can create and build saucers. Do you agree with that? Would you make any other kind of distinctions about the kind of life we're looking for and what that would mean?
There certainly is a distinction, Sean, between, say, multicellular life, animals like us, or highly intelligent life like us, and unicellular life, microorganisms like prokaryotes, bacteria, archaea. Viruses are not necessarily alive, but those kinds of things. Now, all that being said, if we're talking about this in terms of the question of could life arise through natural chemical reactions, it almost doesn't matter whether we're talking about microbial life or advanced multicellular, we're called metazoa, sometimes animal life, because it's all so complex that there's no way that any form of life, in my opinion, could possibly arise through unguided chemical reactions. Even the quote-unquote simplest forms of life, microbial life, is far beyond what any natural processes can produce through blind chemical reactions, whether we're talking on the early Earth or on some other planet or outer space or whatever. He has talked about the fact that life represents a very strange state of matter. It's both high order, meaning low entropy, but also high energy. Now, in our everyday experience of the human-designed world of technology, we see high energy, high order phenomena all the time, okay? But in nature, when you talk about blind chemical reactions that happen naturally and spontaneously, you don't see things that are both high order and high energy coming about ever spontaneously on their own, okay? We can observe natural systems with high energy, but they actually are also very high disorder, okay? They are low order systems. They destroy order, actually, because they're very chaotic. Or we see systems that are very high order, but then they're going to be low energy. And as a geologist, I can tell you, I've got a lot of experience with this because crystals and rocks, very high order, very low entropy, but also low energy, okay? So how do you get things that are both high energy and high order? The second law of thermodynamics says that left to their own devices, things are either going to be high order or high energy, but not both at the same time. You don't have them rising spontaneously. Yet life, no matter what kind of life you're talking about in the universe, so we could entertain arguments from our sci-fi friends, oh, imagine life very different from life on Earth, okay? I don't care what kind of life you're talking about. All life is going to be both high energy and high order. But in all of our experience, that kind of a phenomenon does not arise naturally. So how does life as we know it, and I think even life as we don't know it, would have to do something along the same lines. How does life maintain this high energy, high order state? And the answer is it does it through the use of machines. Our cells are literally full of molecular machines, and much like human machines, Sean, they literally use chemical energy to make mechanical work in order to maintain an extremely high state of high order and high energy. And machines, of course, don't come about randomly either, right? So where do machines come from in our cell? They come from information that is encoded in our DNA, and our cells literally have manufacturing machines we have machines making machines inside of our cells. And so we have machines in our cells that can read and interpret the commands and instructions that are stored in the DNA, execute those instructions through a form of computer-like information processing to build machines. And these machines are able to work against the second law of thermodynamics and maintain this high energy, high order system through information encoded in the DNA that builds these machines. So what we're talking about, Sean, is it is natural in the sense that it exists inside the universe, but it's not natural in the sense that these things never come about through blind chemical reactions. Natural processes never build high energy, high order states that are governed by molecular machines on their own. So in our experience, these kinds of things, okay, what this means is that I don't care whether you're talking about the simplest form of life, because what I just described is an operation in the simplest cell that's ever been discovered, all the way up through every form of animal through human beings, okay? Every form of life that we know of uses this same complex structure to maintain what they call homeostasis, this high order, high energy state, okay? That is going to require intelligent design, because in our experience, these sorts of things, information processing, and machines, they only come from one known source. That is intelligence. We have zero experience, literally, with natural processes creating and generating these high energy, high order, machine governed states of matter. So if we find life elsewhere in the universe, I think you can make a pretty powerful case. It didn't get there through unguided evolution. It had to have been intelligently designed.
Okay, so let's lean into the arguments or responses that people would have to this. One would say, you would say in our experience, but of course we're limited in our experience. We're on one planet in one solar system, one small part of one galaxy amidst hundreds of billions, whatever number of galaxies it is. One argument for aliens is that the universe is so vast that statistically speaking, aliens must exist somewhere. So what's your take on that argument? Because earlier you said in our experience, I'm like, well, we don't have an experience of the rest of the universe. It's so vast. There's got to be life somewhere. And that kind of resonates with many people.
Yeah, so actually, this was the exact argument that President Obama made in that podcast. He said, statistically, the universe is so vast that the odds are good that there's life out there. And I mean, how many times have we heard this argument, right? And you mentioned the movie Contact. Contact, that's where I first heard this argument. I remember seeing that movie when I was in college in 1997 with some friends, and Jodie Foster's character says, the universe is a pretty big place. If it's just us, it seems like an awful waste of space, okay? So this is a very kind of safe argument to make. It doesn't require any hard evidence of aliens, just sort of this supposition with a dash of science that they ought to exist because of the size.
It's somewhat intuitive, like fairly speaking. It's like, yeah, there's enough chances maybe there's life somewhere because it's so abundant on our planet. But keep going.
But exactly. But we have to ask, let's drill down into it. Why do they say that it's so intuitive, that if the universe is so big, that statistically speaking, aliens must or ought to exist? The reason why is they're assuming, there's an evolutionary assumption embedded in that logic. They are assuming that life first arose and evolved naturally on Earth through blind chemical reactions. And so the argument basically is, there's this sort of hidden assumption, is that if you get the right conditions elsewhere, then the same thing will happen. Life will evolve and arise naturally through blind chemical processes. And if the universe is big enough, then surely, statistically speaking, somewhere else you've got to get the right conditions for life to simply arise on its own, maybe even over and over again. This is the sort of embedded assumptions at the heart of that argument. It's often clearly and explicitly stated, okay? So as a scientist, I have major reservations with the first premise of that argument, namely that it evolved naturally. That is not supported by any compelling evidence. Let me actually go back to what we were just talking about. Let's talk not just about the fact that life is this high energy, high order state. Let's talk about the minimal requirements for life, okay? We're talking about life very broadly. You know, we can always speculate about what life could look like elsewhere, but someday we have to literally come back to what science has taught us, what we know from science. The minimal cell, the most simple cell that has been discovered by biologists, has over 500,000 base pairs of nucleotides in its DNA, over 400 protein-coding genes, and some 35 RNA-coding genes. That's called a minimal cell, okay? So that is the quote-unquote simplest form of life. So again, how are you going to get something like that arising through blind natural mechanisms on Earth? Now, the standard rejoinder you're going to hear is that, well, life evolves gradually. Natural selection builds complexity one little step at a time. You don't have to build all that complexity all at once because you can evolve it through random mutation, natural selection, very slowly and gradually, okay? Here's the problem with that argument. If you want to talk about the minimal theoretical requirements for life, again, I think as far as we know, this would apply to any kind of form of life. We're talking about the minimal, sort of at a system level, what is necessary for life to exist. Not just this general concept we talked about earlier that has to be high energy and high order, but the minimal systems. You need systems that can perform energy production. You need selective gateways, what we might call a smart barrier. These are like the cell membrane that every single cell has today. These are smart barriers. They keep harmful molecules out, they let helpful molecules in, and they also let waste out. And actually embedded in these cell membranes are smart molecular machines. They're like little gateways that can recognize molecular fingerprints and either let molecules in or out depending upon what they see. If you don't have these smart barriers, either you can't get the nutrients in that you need for a cell to live, or you're going to let harmful things in that you don't want that will kill the cell. That has to be there from the beginning. You also have to have information processing. We talked earlier about how important information is to generate these molecular machines, but what is necessary at a theoretical level to use information? Well, first of all, you need some kind of an information storage medium, okay? In our cells, we use DNA. All life as we know it uses DNA. But then you need some way to transmit that information out to a place where you can use it. In our cells, we have mRNA, messenger RNA, makes a copy of the information in the DNA and transports it out to the ribosomes of the cells, where you can actually use that information to make these proteins and molecular machines. You also need some abstract set of rules that can govern the conversion of the information in the DNA to the proteins, okay? So our cells have what's called the genetic code, which is actually an abstract theoretical language that cells use to interpret and execute the instructions and commands in our DNA. And there's a whole suite of enzymes that act as those interpreters. They're called amino acyl tRNA synthetases and other molecules like tRNA, which together are able to interpret the information in the DNA and execute its commands. They need a receiver, some kind of a machine that can actually receive the information from the DNA. In our cells, that's called the ribosome. All cells use ribosomes to actually assemble proteins using the information from the DNA. And then you need a whole assembly process after you've made all these proteins to put them together, okay? The point of all this is just using the information in your DNA and having information, being able to use it, is what we would call an irreducibly complex system, Sean. That means that multiple parts have to be there all at once or the system doesn't work. And if any one of those core parts are missing, then you do not have any function and there's no reason for natural selection to produce it. The point of all this, Sean, is this. If any of these systems or subsystems are not present and working properly, we do not know how life can exist. So there's no way for any of this to arise naturally, okay? So again, coming back to our main point here, is that if your evolutionary assumption is that life arose easily on Earth, therefore life can arise elsewhere in the universe, I'm sorry, but I don't see any good scientific evidence for how life can arise through blind chemical reactions. There's no way that blind chemistry can produce this sort of irreducible complexity on steroids of all these multiple systems that are necessary for even the simplest known cell to be able to function. And then to bring it back to intelligent design, sorry, I'll shut up in a second here. Gotta land the plane, yeah. So again, what do we see at the heart of life? We see a language-based code. We see computer-like information processing, and we see machines. And in all of our experience, computer-like information processing, language-based code, and machines, they have only one known cause, and that is intelligence. So again, if life exists elsewhere in the universe, I see it only strengthening the case for intelligent design.
Okay, so let me bring this back and sum this up for everybody. One of the key points is if we assume that life emerged naturally on our planet, and our planet's not that unique, then of course, given how many opportunities there are, it's going to be abundant in the universe. But that's an assumption that has to be demonstrated. But when we look at all the factors that have to line up in the way that you laid it out in such good detail, there's no possible naturalistic story about this. And scientists admit, as far as I'm aware, they don't have a clue how life comes from non-life. If that piece doesn't happen, what we call simple life is anything but simple, by the way. Then we can question that assumption, like we heard in Contact, that happened here must be abundant in the universe. That step is jumped over because we're so influenced by this evolutionary mindset that we buy that secondary argument. Okay.
Exactly.
Let's go to the next one. That's great. All right. So one of the other things I thought about, what about the existence of like humanoid alien life? Basically aliens with a body form that resembles humans in some way. Would that imply being evidence for evolution? Like, is there some kind of silicon or other kind of base type evolution that could take place?
Sure. So this would be like the stereotypical Star Trek alien, right? People always ask,
totally.
Why do the aliens always look like us, right? Well, it's because, they have a limited budget. They can't use CGI for every character in the show. They have to use people, so they got to look kind of like us. But there is that question. And then, of course, people who talk about UFOs will talk about those stereotypical gray aliens. So I'm not expecting this to happen, but let's say that somehow, stereotypical gray aliens land on the White House lawn and say, "Take me to your leader." President Trump posted this sort of silly meme a couple weeks ago. I don't know if you saw this, but it showed him walking next to this big gray alien on some military base. Of course, it was all, AI generated fake, but this is what some people think aliens look like. And if you talk to people, they'll say, well, I saw this. Who knows? Okay. So the question is, if that really happened, would that somehow spell doom for, I don't know, intelligent design, belief in God? Would it prove Darwinism, whatever? I actually think that if we did somehow discover these gray aliens or some kind of a humanoid type alien body that has 2 arms, 2 legs, a head, a couple eyes, kind of like us, this would actually be one of the strongest disproofs of Darwinism that has ever been discovered, okay? Because it would be incredibly improbable for evolution on another planet to independently produce something that looks exactly the same kind of body plan as us. Obviously not identical, but you could never...
But the structure, the body plan you're referring to.
Yes, yes. Now, evolutionary biologists would call this convergent evolution, okay? And so that would... Some people are probably hearing this right now and say, oh, Casey, that's convergent evolution. Don't you know? Well, I would say, yeah, I do know. I took a lot of evolutionary biology. Convergent evolution is basically a term, a placeholder term that evolutionary biologists use to describe when they find similarities that cannot be explained by common ancestry, okay? It's just a term that people will use.
So like the octopus eye very much resembles the human eye. When you look at like the structure of an octopus and the alleged ancestry of them, we clearly didn't evolve from one another. So they independently end at the very similar structure. And so one explanation from Darwinists is, well, there's certain laws that are built in to lead towards that, or the improbability points towards intelligent design. We don't have to land that, but if this is on a whole nother planet with all different factors, lands at this humanoid type being that looks very similar to us, that would be an argument, arguably, for intelligent design, because the odds of that happening in a blind process are essentially impossible.
Bingo.
That's the key point.
That's exactly
okay.
right, Sean. Yeah.
Okay.
So I love that you use the example of the octopus eye, because I love that example as well. If folks aren't familiar with this, octopi, cephalopods, squids, cuttlefish, octopus, they all have 2 eyes, just like us, okay? So normally in evolutionary biology, you find an organism with 2 eyes, you're going to say, oh, the reason why it has 2 eyes and humans have 2 eyes. Do you have any pets, Sean? Or
I'm actually not a pet guy.
Not a
you
pet
called
guy.
me out.
Okay, all right. Well, my wife and I have a cat. I was just staying with some family down here in Southern California. They have a dog, okay? So obviously, other mammals have 2 eyes. And the standard go-to explanation from evolutionary biology for why we have 2 eyes and cats and dogs have 2 eyes is simple inheritance from a common ancestor, okay? So that's an easy one. But the problem with the octopus is, yes, it has 2 eyes, but nobody thinks that the common ancestor of humans and mollusks or cephalopods had 2 eyes. In fact, we don't even know if it had eyes to begin with. And it gets even crazier, Sean, because when you look at the basic design of the octopus eye, it has a camera type eye whose basic design is very, very, very similar to the human eye. It's not identical, but it's incredibly similar. So we see these incredible degrees of similarity between human eyes and octopus eyes, and it all has to be the result of convergent evolution. So evolutionary biologists, they just say, oh, isn't it amazing what evolution can do? But, even Richard Dawkins said, and let me see if I can find this quote here. I'm not finding the quote, but let's get back to humanoid life, okay? If humanoid life was discovered, even evolutionary biologists recognize that this would be incredibly unlikely under a standard evolutionary view. David Raup was a paleontologist at the University of Chicago, very decent guy, actually. And I found a quote from him. Here's what he said. The majority of evolutionary biologists find the chance of an independent evolution of a recognized humanoid creature to be essentially nil. Why is that? Because the likelihood of blind evolution producing something so similar to us is just so low, they don't even consider it possible. Even over the last couple of weeks, Neil deGrasse Tyson, the famous physicist, who is, I think he's an agnostic, and he talks a lot about questions of evolution and origin. He actually had an op-ed in the New York Times talking about this alien disclosure and all that. And he said that if we discovered, quote unquote, humanoid aliens, that would, quote, shock him. And why did he say this? Because he said it would violate everything we know about biodiversity. Okay, and the reason, what he's getting at here is that such a high degree of similarity would be completely unlikely to evolve independently. So even one UFO disclosure guy, his name is Luis Elizondo. He's one of the guys who testified at these congressional hearings. He was in that Age of Disclosure film, and I watched an interview with him a couple weeks ago. He actually said in this interview that if we found aliens with a humanoid form, that would show a quote-unquote common link. Okay, what is that common link? It's exactly what you were saying. It's actually common design. It points to a common designer. We have lots of experience with intelligent agents reusing similar parts in different systems, right? Intelligent agents will use wheels on both cars and airplanes, or keyboards on tablets and cell phones.
Even iPads and formerly iPods and the iPhone. Similar design, but we adapt it to different ends. So that makes total sense. Designers would
Absolutely.
do that.
When I write computer code, when I want to write a new program, the very first thing I do is I hit Control-C, Control-V. I copy an old program I wrote that has similar function for the one that I need, and I start with code I've already written. Okay, so it's a very good technology design strategy to reuse parts that work in different designs. So I would argue that the reason for the similar body plan, if we were to discover these, quote unquote humanoid aliens, it would point to a common designer between both us and those quote unquote humanoid aliens.
That's super interesting. I'd never thought of it that way. And it does raise the question, all these images we have of these humanoid aliens coming all over, is that more human projection or actual evidence of aliens? Probably much more human projection. But if we did find them and they mirrored us, you're right, that would be best explained, arguably, and Neil deGrasse Tyson would be shocked by this as by a common designer rather than just chance, given how unpurposed and unplanned and how many just step by step over time makes it mathematically improbable.
Yeah,
Okay,
it certainly
good
is a very
stuff.
big if. We have not discovered.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah,
No,
I'm with you on that.
No,
100%.
that's great. So let's jump to the next one. So some people invoke aliens as the creators of humankind. And this would take us aside, but it is interesting to take the picture. We were talking about this of like E.T. with the fingers that are meeting, and then the new like hands that are meeting with Disclosure Day. Going back to the Sistine Chapel of God's hand and human hand, like Steven Spielberg is suggesting something interesting here. Some people will invoke aliens kind of as our creators, so to speak. And the movie Prometheus, the Aliens movie from years ago, kind of has alien beings seeding the planet to explain where we come from our origin. What do you make of this?
Yeah, so there are a lot of folks out there that have proposed that we were made by aliens. Even some serious people like Francis Crick, the co-discoverer of the structure of DNA, who won the Nobel Prize with others for making that discovery. He proposed that there was directed panspermia, the idea that life on Earth was directly seeded by aliens. Now, what's interesting is the reason that Crick proposed that is because he believed that it was basically impossible for life on Earth to evolve through blind natural processes. So he kind of wanted to just kick the question back. Maybe
he admitted that was part of his motivation. Do we know that? That's what really motivated him to suggest this?
Well, I can tell you that this is a direct quote from Crick. He said, "An honest man armed with all the knowledge available to us now could only state that in some sense, the origin of life appears at the moment to be almost a miracle. So many are the conditions which have had to have been satisfied to get it going." And then he went on to basically push the question back and say, well, maybe aliens did it, okay? So if you want to argue that aliens made life on Earth, I suppose you can do that, but it just pushes the question back. It doesn't actually answer, where did life come from in our universe originally? Where did those aliens come from? I think eventually you need some designer that is outside of space and time to get life going on this planet. Now, yeah.
Okay, so I was going to say, if it's almost like you're digging out a hole to fill another hole, but then now you have a hole. So it pushes it back. And at some point, if life is so complex, it's going to have to come something really smart and really capable of doing this. That's where he's pushing it back, but not explaining its origin. So technically, intelligent design of like the cell could be explained by some super brilliant, intelligent UFO. Maybe in theory, it wouldn't go beyond that. If I'm not mistaken, maybe even Dawkins suggested at some point that there could be a designer within the universe. And so Prometheus has a level of plausibility. If there's these super brilliant, at least logical aliens that seeded our planet, okay, like that's a logical possibility. But are there certain things within the universe itself that couldn't be explained by an alien within the universe? And give me the quick version of these, because I've done deep dives in these channels, but I want people to make the connection of what could be explained by an alien in principle and what could not.
Yeah, by the way, Dawkins did say in the documentary Expelled, he
That's
said
right,
that
it was
he
in
would-
Expelled.
It was amazing that Ben Stein got him to say this on camera.
Yes, he
basically, that if he would be okay with intelligent design if it was aliens, okay? So I guarantee you that if someday, some alien shows up and says, I'm your creator, all these people who used to be anti-ID, they're suddenly going to be fine with it, okay? They weren't okay with it if it was God, but somehow they're okay with it if it's aliens. I find that to be a little bit suspicious. But the bottom line is, as you were saying, it pushes the question back. And you're going to need some super intelligent being to get life going. I mean, intelligent design in biology could be okay with a natural intelligence or a supernatural intelligence. I'll fully acknowledge that. But there are other aspects of the universe that I think are very difficult to explain from a natural intelligence. And you just did a great show with Steve Meyer recently.
We had him on 3 times.
Three
It was
times, yeah, that's
amazing.
right.
Yeah.
Man, you guys have done some heavyweight shows talking about the evidence and the need for a transcendent external creator to the universe. And I will not do a deep dive on this because you've covered this big time. But obviously the best evidence, and I think a majority of physicists would agree, that the universe came into existence at a beginning some 13 billion years ago from a infinitely small, infinitely dense singularity. And this, creating that singularity, getting the universe going, requires some first cause. But that first cause can never be an alien. It can never be an ET flying around in these UFO crafts or whatever people might think they are, okay? It suggests the action of some super powerful, supernatural first cause that exists outside of space and time, outside the universe. As Stephen, you were saying, that's basically the job description we usually give to God, right?
Totally.
So I think that the consensus view in physics and cosmology would be that you need a first cause that sounds a lot like God, all right? At least that's the way I would interpret it. Now, obviously, some folks will say that, okay, maybe you could have other models that don't require beginning of the universe, but as you and Steve talked about, that means you need additional fine-tuning. The laws of the universe, the laws of nature have to be very exquisitely crafted in order to get a universe where life can exist, okay? Again, no alien can fine-tune the laws of the universe on a global scale to make a universe that is friendly to the existence of life.
And that's because they're within the universe, and they can't exist unless there first is a universe, number one, that exists, and number two is fine-tuned for life. So they can't be the explanation for where the universe came from, let alone why it's fine-tuned.
100%.
Okay.
100%. So
that makes sense.
If you want to invoke aliens and you want to, look for some designer that's another alien, you can never escape the need for a transcendent designer who exists outside of space and time, serves as the first cause for our universe to get the Big Bang going and to fine-tune the laws of nature so that life can exist, whether alien or human or whatever, okay? Let me just give you, I know you've talked about this with Steve, but I just want to give my own little take on one of the fine-tuning parameters here, okay? If you think about one of the necessary parameters for life to exist, you have to have matter being basically in a close enough proximity to be able to interact to form life, okay? You also need a place for life to exist. Things like planets, okay? In order for matter to sort of have a distribution where it can actually interact, it actually requires an incredible degree of fine-tuning. There are kind of two extreme ways that matter could be distributed in the universe. It could be distributed extremely sparsely, where it's all spread out, or all the matter could be clumped together all in one place, where it's like one super giant massive black hole, in some place in the universe, okay? It turns out that to get a universe with sort of this intermediate degree of distribution of matter is very, very difficult. And one of the fine-tuning parameters was actually articulated by Roger Penrose, who I know that you've talked about. And this is what he says in his book, The Emperor's New Mind, that in order to get the initial entropy of the universe such that you could have matter distributed in a way where you can have things like galaxies and stars and planets forming, you would need fine-tuning to within 1 part in 10 raised to the power raised to 10 to the 123rd power. Okay,
number,
it's you could, if you were to try to write that number out, you would die, trillions of years before you'd write it out. Okay, just would never happen. So the bottom line is, we have an incredible degree of fine-tuning in this universe, and it points to the need for not an extraterrestrial designer, not a cosmic designer, but a transcendent supernatural designer outside the universe, which no alien could ever be.
That's a great distinction. Very, very helpful. Now, one of the questions that comes up, and there's kind of a theological angle to this one, Casey, and a scientific one, is why would God make such a vast universe and not put life everywhere? In other words, is there any theological angle you can put on the claim the universe is so big, there must be life somewhere?
Yeah, I mean, great question, Sean. I'm not a theologian, but I kind of suggested we talk about this because this comes up. It's kind of like the theological or like the Christian version of the argument that you hear, the universe is so big, therefore, life must exist elsewhere. So, the argument is basically, if God made this big universe, why would he do that if he wasn't intending it, to have life all throughout it? And my answer is, well, who am I to say what God did or did not do? If God wanted to fill up the universe with life, he could certainly do that. I find that anytime somebody asks the question, could God have, the answer is almost always yes, unless you're talking about something that's, immoral
logically
or limits his power.
Yeah.
But God can do whatever he wants, and I'm not here to put God in a box by any stretch. However, if we're asking the question that God, because of the size of the universe, therefore God must have, or God is obligated to fill it up with life, there I would say, well, I'm not so sure about that. Because the question is, could there be other reasons for why God would create this vast, grand universe other than simply needing to fill it up with life? And think about Psalm 19, which says that the heavens declare the glory of God. And that literally the heavens speak in a language that goes throughout the cosmos, and there's nowhere that language is not heard. That's what Psalm 19 says. So I think that one very, biblically consistent reason for why God might create this vast universe could be simply to display his glory. Now, that doesn't mean God didn't make life elsewhere. Maybe he did. It's not for me to say what God did or did not do. However, I don't accept the argument that because the universe is so big, therefore, God had to have put life elsewhere. He could have, but he didn't have to. It might just simply be to display and declare his amazing glory. And that's why the universe is so vast and incredible.
That's fair. I have a 2 cents on this, then I have 2 more questions for you. One is to ask, why wouldn't God put life everywhere? Well, whenever we ask the question, why about God, we only know if God tells us. We're asking for access to the mind of God. And God hasn't told us. So we're going to have to guess. But we do know that rather than having an anthropocentric view where we think all of life is about us, the Bible's actually about God. It's his story. In the beginning, God. And so God gets joy and pleasure and goodness in creation, even if there's not life as we know it. It's not just all for us. That's a anthropocentric rather than a theocentric view. So bottom line, we don't know, but we shouldn't expect that God would create things the way we want him to create things for our purposes. He might have other purposes.
And for all those Christians or people who want God to make other life, well, if you're a traditional Judeo-Christian theist, God did make other spiritual beings. He did make other intelligences besides human beings. How they may or may not relate to the UFO phenomenon is a conversation for another day. I'm not at all going to go there, but
we better not go down that road. That opens up another can of worms. Okay, so 2 more questions. One is, it does seem that organic life seems to be common in the universe. It's been detected.
Organic molecules.
Okay, organic molecules. Yeah. Make that distinction. It's been detected meteorites, comets, interstellar clouds appear to be some building blocks of life appear to be widespread throughout the cosmos. You're right. It's building blocks of life, not necessarily life. So if building blocks are everywhere, couldn't we have life in the many places, even though we've only really looked in a small amount?
Yeah, so that's a great question, Sean. And I remember I actually, when I was an undergraduate at UC San Diego, took a seminar course from Stanley Miller, the famous the famous scientist.
That's cool.
Who used this flask that he put chemicals in, zapped it with electricity, and lo and behold, out came amino acids. And this was supposed to be sort of evidence that you could produce amino acids on the early Earth. He discovered actually a process that is probably going on also in outer space, certain chemical reactions that can produce amino acids. But I'll never forget what Stanley Miller said during the seminar course that I took from him. He said, making chemicals or making compounds and making life are 2 very different things, okay?
Wow, that's fascinating he said that.
What a great admission. He actually said that a number of times over his career. And so very, very interesting. Yes, it is true we can produce some of these very, very simple organic molecules like amino acids. But to say that's a far cry from forming life is just, the understatement of the century, okay? What you get in these reactions is you get what's called a racemic mixture. Amino acids can come in a left-handed form or right-handed form. Life only uses left-handed amino acids, but these chemical reactions give you left and right-handed forms. So they don't give you just, the form that we need for life. They also produce all kinds of amino acids that are not used in life. And if you want to talk about what else they produce mostly tar and goop that would be highly toxic and destructive to any life. But let's just say, for the sake of argument, that somehow you could get amino acids that are the type that are used in life. Then somehow you have to string them together, okay, to form polymers. To my knowledge, we have not found polymers, things like peptides or primitive proteins in these meteorites or these comets. If you think that's easy to do, by the way, and you think, well, maybe there is some little pocket of water where molecules can move around and find one another and link up, the last place in the universe you would want to form proteins or peptides through what's called polymerization, hooking up these amino acid monomers into polymers, the last place you would want to do that is actually a water-based environment. That actually water drives the reaction of amino acids hooking up backwards. It causes them to actually disassociate and depolymerize. The chemical reaction is actually amino acids coming together. They form a short peptide and a water molecule. And according to Le Chatelier's principle, you cannot have a chemical reaction go forward in the presence of its products. So if you're in a water-based environment, you cannot drive that reaction forward. It's going to actually drive it backward and break these peptides up. So it's origin of life theorists have had great difficulty explaining how you would get primitive polymers and long organic molecules to form on the early Earth or in abiotic environments. But let's say you could do that, okay? In order to get a functional protein, you need to get these amino acids in the right order in order to form a functional protein. And research on proteins has shown that, say, for a typical enzyme.
We had Doug Axe to talk about.
You had Doug Axe. You guys know about this.
He's our man here. Yep.
Doug is the man.
We will point people to that interview, but you're right. The key point you're making is you have to have the right kind of amino acids. You have to have the right bonds. They have to be in the right order and strung together, in the right environment. And you start adding these together, and this is where even the most simple, protein fold like you described is well beyond the possibility of chance, even given the resource of our universe, is what Doug Axe argues. And so this is the key point. Just because we find the building blocks of life widespread, that is a long ways from what's called simple life, let alone animal life, let alone technological life that's intelligent like we are, and more intelligent to send spaceships around the universe. These steps are huge, which brings me to my last question for you. I think, like I said earlier, there's something intuitive about saying the universe is so big, there's got to be life somewhere. But in my study of the privileged planet and the origin of life, it started to make me realize, oh my goodness, there are so many things that have to be made right for that to take place. Paint that picture for us. And what I mean by that is you've got to have so many things like the origin of intelligence, the emergence of consciousness. You got to have the right planets. Without getting lost in too many details, kind of paint the picture for us of what would have to take place to have the kind of ETs that would even potentially visit us in some fashion.
Sure, Sean. And before we talk about this, we're going to talk about necessary and sufficient conditions.
Great
okay?
distinction.
Because some things are going to be necessary to get a smart humanoid type organism that can use metallurgy to make technology, but that may not be sufficient to get you all the way there. There's a lot of things that have to go right. So first you need a privileged planet like Earth, okay? You need the right kind of planet and star system. Of course, on Earth, we find exactly that right kind of planet, but here are some of the parameters you need. A stable sun that produces the right type of energy. Lots of water. Planetary geologists have actually found it very difficult to explain how a rocky planet in the inner solar system like Earth could have as much water as Earth does. And just having water, that's a necessary condition, but it's not sufficient. You also need to get liquid water. It has to be at the right distance from the sun so you get liquid water. You've got to have a rocky planet with a stable surface. You need a magnetic field to protect the Earth and the life on that planet from radiation. You need plate tectonics that can recycle the elements that are needed for life. You need the proper atmospheric conditions. You need the right rotation rate, not what's called tidal locking, where it's always facing the host star. You need to have some kind of rotation to give it a balanced climate. Axial tilt also is very helpful for giving it a balanced climate with season. And in order to have an axial tilt that is stable, you might need a moon to stabilize the tilt of the planet. You probably also need large other planets, like we have Jupiter and Saturn, these gas giants that can absorb a lot of the meteorite impactors in that solar system, so you're not constantly getting hit and sterilizing your little planet. You've also got to be in the right part of the galaxy, okay? If you're too close to the center of the galaxy, there's going to be maybe a giant black hole or too much radiation. But if you're too far from the center of the galaxy, you might not have enough heavy metals to generate what's needed for a living organism. So you kind of got to be in the Goldilocks zone for getting the right amount of radiation and also elements. You might also need UV ozone to block out UV radiation. Okay, so you could have all that, all right? But again, those are all necessary parameters for life.
That's right.
But then to get life, we've already talked about all the different components that are needed for the simplest known cell. I mean, we won't rehash that. You can rewatch the beginning.
Yep.
But let's say that somehow you could get advanced life on a planet, okay, that's intelligent, that's smart. Now you got to be able to produce technology. And it turns out that getting technology requires a whole additional suite of parameters just to be able to produce something like a spaceship, okay? Michael Denton, I'm going to give him credit for a lot of these arguments. He has a book called The Miracle of Man, where he outlines many of the requirements for an intelligent species to be able to use technology. First of all, you're going to need the ability to make fire. Now that might sound easy, but actually a lot goes in to being able to use fire. You have to have organisms that aren't in an ocean. Okay, you can't use fire obviously underwater. So these have to be land-dwelling organisms. You have to have the right atmospheric composition, just the right level of oxygen. So it's enough to be able to do respiration and combustion, but not too much, or you might have your atmosphere spontaneously combust every time there's a lightning storm, okay? And then what about the other 78% of the atmosphere? We think of it being as unimportant, but it turns out that nitrogen, which composes, the vast majority of our atmosphere, it's the perfect gas to prevent the flow of fire and preventing combustion from taking over everywhere.
Amazing.
You need a hydrological cycle to be able to allow minerals and those elements that are needed for technology to be exposed. And then, of course, you need fuel, okay? Fuel comes from plants and some kind of organism on that planet that can create a source of carbon that can be combusted in order to make fuel. As far as we know, that requires photosynthesis. Photosynthesis itself, a very highly complicated molecular
But if not
pathway.
some other process like photosynthesis, that itself is incredibly complex.
Which is going to require the right form of radiation and light being emitted by the host star, an atmosphere that is transparent to that kind of light, and you're going to need, basically being able to produce the right form of carbon that can then be used for combustion. And of course, don't forget the ambient temperature. If you have the wrong temperature, if you're not in the right Goldilocks zone, combustion cannot happen. So there's a lot that goes into just our being able to use fire, to be able to create metal and metallurgy. Then there's the physical size of human beings. We can't be as small as ants or as large as giants. We wouldn't be able to generate the kinetic forces that are needed or basically being able to work with metals if we're not the right sizes. Having hands. Most species on Earth don't have hands that could work with metals. Even chimpanzees don't have an opposable thumb like we do, okay? And you got to be able to twirl those sticks, right, to be able to get those fires going. So that in and of itself is fine motor control that our hands have is very, very unique among species on planet Earth. Our bipedalism plays a role. That frees our hands up, gives us a forward gaze, so we can manipulate all kinds of tools. Again, we don't think about everything that goes in to being able to use technology. Then, of course, the planet itself has to have properties, not just for life, but for technology. You've got to have the right size planet that can allow for bipedalism. You're going to need oxygen in the atmosphere. It turns out that many planets, Venus, for example, has an electrical field that caused it to lose its oxygen, okay? No combustion is going to happen on Venus. Metallurgy, all the right elements have to be there on the planet natively to be able to do this. So bottom line is that it's not an accident that we are able to use technology on planet Earth. It's what Michael Denton calls anthropic prior fitness, or the primal blueprint. all these parameters had to be just right just for us to be able to use technology. So you get all those parameters right, maybe ETs will be able to make spaceships elsewhere, but there's a lot, it's a very, very tall order.
And we haven't gotten to the space travel and all that would entail. So this intuition, I kind of want to land the plane with this one. This intuition of like, the universe is so big and life's got to be somewhere. I resonate with that. There's part of me that's intrigued, and we love Star Trek because God has made us to want to explore the universe. But you're right. One of the first points you made was we just assume life emerged naturally here. Therefore, it's abundant in the universe. We miss all the things that have to be right. And we haven't even talked about how these things point towards intelligent design. You have to have the right sun, the right kind, of the right age, the right distance, the right orbit. If it gets too close, things burn up. If it gets too far, it gets too cold. You have to have the right atmosphere, the right tilt, the right moon, protective giants, on and on and on. And that's why in the first version of Privileged Planet, Jay Richards and Guillermo Gonzalez, they predicted. They said, we predict as we find more planets, we will not find any capable of supporting life like Earth. And now it's somewhere around 5,000 or so, correct me if I'm wrong, in the latest edition. And that's exactly right. They get a few factors right, but never close. And all those are necessary conditions for there to be life. Then you need the origin of life improbable. And Doug Axe talked about here, this is the first time I had really thought about this. He said he actually thinks from the first life to human organisms takes more information and steps than from non-life to life. So the improbability is just of aliens coming, unless they're designed, is effectively zero. So if aliens show up, your argument is, this is a good argument for intelligent design. Well, man, I have so many more questions about this. This is fun, fascinating topic. Great job bringing data to bear. Will you be watching the movie? You're going to go see it?
I already got my tickets.
You already
Yep. The theater was totally empty when I bought them. But no, Sean, you gave a great summary of the argument here. The bottom line, to really bring this home without giving too much data dump, which I apologize for,
Sure.
Is that I think if you are somebody who does believe in a creator, and you're wondering, what would the discovery of UFO, ETs from other planets, what would that mean for my faith, my Christian faith, or anybody who really believes in a creator God? I think it doesn't pose any threat. If anything, it's going to strengthen the case for intelligent design and challenge Darwinism. So I think that obviously what remains to be seen what the future holds. Nobody knows what's going to be discovered or what's going to happen with all this disclosure. But I think that even if it does turn out to be little gray humanoid aliens, rest assured that does not challenge people who want to make a case for belief in God.
I totally agree. Now, there's other theological questions we could explore. Even C.S. Lewis dealt with some of these kind of questions and didn't feel like they threatened Christianity. So we haven't dealt with those theological questions here, but I think similarly, there's answers to them as well. Case, this was fun, man. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you, Sean. A lot of fun.